So the 2024 US presidential election just got put right on its head with a historical unusual development. Joe Biden, the current president, just dropped out of the race as of July 21st, basically ending his run for a second term. And this came after his really bad performance at the debate last month. So, following that, he started bleeding in the polls, and his approval rating that was already suffering went down to, well, even more historic lows. He likely realized that the odds were plummeting and couldn't be recovered, and his mental state had clearly proven too much of a burden to grapple with, and he was convinced by other Democratic leaders to give it up. And immediately after doing so, he endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. So instead of the election now being a battle between two geriatric boomers, it's now a battle between one geriatric boomer and a not yet geriatric boomer. So, right off the bat, being almost 2 decades younger than Biden gives Democrats a candidate who can form coherent sentences, which, clearly a bonus. Harris will be able to more effectively articulate a case against Trump way more than Biden ever could, and that definitely makes Trump a bit more nervous for sure. There's a few clear pros and cons to point out about Harris. Um, the cons I'll get to in a few, but one big pro is that she's a blank slate because she's not as known as Biden. The VP is typically just in line in case they need to become president at some point. That's really where their job begins and ends in the public eye. And that helps alleviate a lot of that baggage. Another pro is that she's young compared to her predecessors and viewed as relatively progressive, something that can help Democrats sway more younger voters that were turning away, especially on issues related to Israel-Palestine. Her position is still not really in tune with young voters, but it's closer to that than Biden's was. And one other factor that I don't think means too much but may mean much to other voters to some degree, perhaps, is she's a woman of color. She would make a double whammy in history with this, because she would be the first woman of color president and also the first woman president. Many people may feel excited about that. Keyword may, because remember how 2016 went. But there's also many cons to take note of, and these are gonna likely possibly be hard for her to grapple with. The first obvious issue is even with her replacing Biden, recent polls still show that Donald Trump remains in the lead. It's a lot smaller, but it's noteworthy. And I think Democrats, a lot of them, won't want to accept this for now, but it'll probably become obvious soon that Trump isn't as hated as he was in 2016 when he won. In fact, he's more popular now than he's ever been before. His favorability rating, especially following a certain thing that happened a couple weeks ago, is at an all-time high. Now, Kamala Harris isn't that unpopular herself, but it's not like she's doing a ton better than Biden generally. She's still tied to his unpopular record as president as well, being the vice president, a part of the administration. And for all the reinforcement she's gotten, Donald Trump's reinforcement makes that have little of an impact on making the race a clear, favorable environment for Democrats. I think Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are going to have relatively similar favorabilities from now to November. The country is just super partisan, and either of these two being liked by a majority of Americans is kind of hard to imagine. And another con to Kamala Harris may be a foil to a pro of hers that I earlier mentioned, which is her being viewed as more progressive than Biden. Despite what many may think, especially on Twitter, the United States electorate isn't that progressive. It's more common for someone to identify as conservative than liberal, according to polls, and according to data on elections. Moderates, they make up the plurality, and they're very wary of anybody being considered, very liberal. And Of course, liberal and leftist don't mean the same thing, but in American politics, liberal is left and conservative is right. So if you're non-American and watching this, then yeah, if in America, if someone is considered liberal, that just means they're more to the left. Um, yeah. Kamala Harris, she has the most left-leaning voting record of any senator. Now, that is a bit of a misleading statistic because she was only in the Senate for a short while, so it wasn't really hard to rack that up, especially when her Senate term was under a Republican president only, that being Trump. Um, but, I mean, it still is the case. And when she ran for president, she sort of backed away from the stances considered left leaning. Um, and obviously, Bernie Sanders is clearly the most leftist senator in the country overall. But again, that voting record, you just can't. It's gonna tangle you in there, and you can't really distance yourself from that. And a general electorate that might not be super popular with them. And another contradictory con, I don't think Kamala Harris improving Democrat numbers with young voters indicates a victory. Young voters are generally more left-leaning and would probably like the fact that she's more progressive than Biden. But here's the problem with relying on young people. They don't vote. Okay, maybe that's a little hyperbolic. Young people do come out to vote, but it's not super frequent, and it's certainly not at the frequency of older voters. There's a reason that consistently exit polls show that they are the smallest part of the electorate. Young people are not a reliable voting bloc, something that Bernie Sanders, to mention him again, learned the hard way in the 2020 primary when he lost to Biden, who owed his victory to older voters who always vote. And, there's a lot of misconceptions about Democratic victories that they attribute to younger voters coming out. Biden beating Trump in 2020, a lot of people say that was younger voters, like Gen Z, millennials, but in reality, that wasn't really the case. Biden's victory came from white, college-educated suburban women, and this is the demographic that barely swung it to Biden over Trump. And in the 2022 midterms, young voters were again given credit, despite these same women being the ones to do it again, and it was kind of obvious because Roe v. Wade just got overturned. So I really think this is not a demographic that is as reliable as Democrats want to believe, and I think they kind of get that, but I feel like they consistently don't they spend too much time focusing on a demographic that is never going to be guaranteed to come out for them. And the demographic that Kamala Harris should focus on if she wants to win should be those white, college-educated suburban women that have been moving away from Republicans in recent years in a relatively quick pace. I definitely expect that Donald Trump is going to continue to struggle with these voters in November. But again, the amount remains to be seen. Harris being viewed as progressive will sell well to people who are progressive, but those voting blocs are typically unreliable and they don't amount to the rest of the electorate. So they may be more antagonistic to Kamala Harris if Trump is able to successfully tie her to that voting record and how it appears. I also feel that Trump is going to continue to do well with the voting bloc that swung his 2016 victory to him, which was white working class voters in the Midwest. And adding to this, he's still making inroads with non-white voters. Harris kind of blunted that to a degree in recent polls, but the data still shows it's still a recession for Democrats in these blocks, especially with Hispanic voters. And, I mean, Kamala Harris is a former DA from San Francisco, the former senator of California. She is going to be viewed as a coastal urban elite and part of the establishment by many of the voters in middle America, primarily like the Rust Belt and places like that, that Donald Trump has consistently touted himself as the anti of. So this is something that maybe her VP pick can alleviate, but it's no promise. Overall, this is looking like it's going to be a really competitive election. I still think that Joe Biden, had he stayed in the race, would have tightened it as we got closer to November. I just feel that Kamala Harris, all the momentum she's having is mostly a lot of wary Democrats who were unsure at first now falling in line faster, which enthusiasm is really good, but the race remains a toss up, and it will likely stay that way until November, so it's anyone's game.